Welcome to Eastern Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. I'm Anca Filipovici, researcher at the Romanian Institute for Research on National Minorities. This series is part of the Institute of Historical Researchers' Centennial Commemorations, Our Century, Looking Back, Thinking Forward, and has been organized by the BASIS Study Group for Minority History. It was made possible through the help and support of the British Association of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to researching minorities in the national and regional histories of Central, Eastern, and Southeast Europe and promoting closer scholarly collaborations. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. On this episode, Andrei Cușco, researcher at the Xenopol Institute of History in Iași, Romania, talks to us about the history of Bessarabia and its various minority communities before the Second World War. We will discuss thus about borderlands, about territories in an intermediary position, looking at different centers of political power that claim control over these territories. So, Andrei, welcome to the podcast.
I'm glad to be here.
Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in this area of history?
Yes, well, in my case, I guess, it's a mixed story. It stems both from my personal experience, since I was born in the borderland that I studied for, well, over 15 years now, I would say. And also, I was fortunate enough to follow a quite challenging academic trajectory at the Central European University, challenging, I would say, in the positive meaning of this word. So I guess that I can say that in my case, this personal dimension was happily connected to the scholarly one. Well, I started my academic career, if that does not sound too pretentious.
It doesn't.
Well, over 20 years ago, by focusing on the historiographical dimension of the representation of the Bessarabian Romanians in the Russian writings of the 19th and early 20th century. So from the earliest point in my academic trajectory, I was already interested in how one of the main ethnic communities of this region was discursively constructed, as it were, in the Russian imperial historiography. And from that moment on, somehow this seamlessly led me to focus on wider processes, on broader processes of, well, nation building, of empire building at this periphery, but most of all, on the clash of several competing discourses on this region of Bessarabia. But when so this sort of is the personal dimension I was referring to. Okay. In that, yes, I was really interested in how this dynamics of ethnicity was constructed as a discourse in during the imperial period. But when I'm referring to the academic luck that I experienced as a young scholar, I would refer to, of course, to the very seminal and quite creative scholarly atmosphere at the Central European University, where I pursued my MA and PhD degrees in the early mid-2000s. And again, I was fortunate enough to be a part of a very thriving scholarly community studying the Eurasian continental empires. And of course, I clearly understood that the Bessarabian experience I was so interested in before should be reframed in terms of a borderland, in terms of a territory that was an object of rival projects of state building. In a way, this context, this scholarly context of empire studies in new imperial history and the preoccupation for how borderlands were constructed both symbolically and politically framed my understanding of where my regional history could fit in this broader regional, mega regional, so to say, picture. Yeah.
Okay, I see. So you combined your personal interest with your professional one, and it turned into a book published in 2017, right? A book called A Contested Borderland, Competing Russian and Romanian Visions of Bessarabia in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was a book published at Central European University Press. And I would like to start from this question, from this book, and ask you, where is this historical region of Bessarabia located, and how was it politically constructed in the 19th century? And of course, why have you referred to it as a contested borderland?
Yes, well, to start with the end of your question, it should be already obvious that the conceptual framework that I was exposed to during my PhD studies contributed a lot to my understanding of how this political contestation was emerged and why exactly I chose to see Bessarabia as a contested borderland between two rival political centers of power. But let me return to that later in the second part of my answer. And to return to your first to the first part of your question, Bessarabia as a region actually is a quite ephemeral phenomenon on the map of Europe, in the sense that this region existed as a coherent territorial entity for, well, just over a century and 130 years, from 1812 until 1940. Since before 1812, there was no clear territorial precedent to the region later called Bessarabia, and after 1940, it was again split, as it is today, between the Republic of Moldova and Ukraine. So Bessarabian history proper comprises, I would say, quite a brief era in comparison to other regions of Europe, which can be traced back many centuries. But exactly this ephemeral nature of the region itself, again, and I emphasize here as a coherent whole, is also a virtue for scholarly analysis. So it is both an issue, a problem, and an opportunity for scholarly analysis, because this region emerged sort of ex nihilo. So it was a creation of the imperial Russian project. And even the name itself, which is, by the way, ironically now widely used also in Romanian historiography and political discourse, right? Was in fact an imposition and on the whole territory of the Russian imperial authorities, who simply lacked any alternative. Because, of course, Bessarabia proper is just the southern part of the region later labeled as such, comprising the territory between the Danube, the Black Sea, and the two rivers that frame this Mesopotamia of Eastern Europe, the Prut and the Dniester, right? And the choice of name itself, the choice of the capital, which is the current capital of the Republic of Moldova, Chisinau, which was motivated strictly by geographical considerations, since there was no precedent, there was no important city that was situated in the central part of the province that would qualify as a headquarters of a new province, shows to what extent it was, again, the region itself was a construction the Russian administrative and, to an extent, literary elites. So, to properly frame Bessarabian history during the 19th and early 20th century, during the Russian imperial period, one should first say that there was an inherent duality, both in the province itself, territorially speaking, and discursively speaking. What I mean here concretely is the following. This region had a very diverse trajectory in its southern and northern parts, central northern parts, whereas the center and most of the northern regions of Bessarabia were inhabited by a Romanian-speaking majority. The southern part became a territory of colonization. That is a territory which was targeted by the imperial authorities as a land to be cultivated, to be populated by useful, ethnic communities coming from elsewhere. Well, I guess we'll talk about that a bit later, but what I want to say now is that this dualism framed both imperial policies and the dynamics of ethnicity in the region later. Okay, so in terms of construction of the region, when Bessarabia was annexed by the Russian Empire, its status oscillated between that of a Western borderland, that is a territory more akin to the Kingdom of Poland or Finland, with a full-fledged elite, with presumably solid social structures, and with a strategy that involved indirect rule, that is the co-opting of native elites. So that is one possible scenario pursued by the Russian authorities in the first decades after the annexation. But on the other hand, because of this colonizing drive that I mentioned, especially in the southern parts, and because it was associated with the civilizing mission of the Russian Empire, the region was also perceived alternatively as part of New Russia, Novorossiya. That is the regions to the east of the Dniester River, the North Pontic steppe, basically. That was the object, the preferred object of colonization with settlers invited from abroad, starting from the reign of Catherine II. So in a way, during the first half of the 19th century, especially until the 1830s, so during the first 2-3 decades after the annexation, Bessarabia was constantly oscillating on the mental map and also on the political, map of devising governmental strategies, was constantly oscillating between its status as a Western borderland, as a region that could, in principle, be treated as more developed than the Russian internal provinces, and this view of the territory as a space for colonization for the civilizing mission of the empire. Well, so this dilemma was eventually solved by categorizing Bessarabia as a region more similar to New Russia, to this region of colonization, than to the Western borderlands. And it determined the trajectory of its gradual administrative, social, and political integration into the Russian imperial system, so that especially after the mid-1830s, when the Danube frontier in the American meaning of the word was closed from the Russian point of view, especially after in 1834 the Russian administration retreated from the Romanian principalities, Bessarabia was gradually transformed into a more or less normal Russian province. So what's happening in a way, and this is another possibility of understanding the history of the region in this period, is that the direct gaze, the direct interaction of Russian officials with this province was gradually substituted by a more bureaucratic approach, and Bessarabia slowly became a normal Russian gubernia, so that by the 1870s it was its final vestiges of political and administrative peculiarity were just dissolved or disappeared. On the other hand, why a contested borderland after all? So it was contested politically during these first 2 or 3 decades after its annexation within the Russian Empire itself, between these two alternative models I referred to. But after the 1860s, and this is the main argument of my book actually, after the 1860s, it became contested symbolically and discursively by the Russian Empire on the one hand, of course, and on the other hand, by the emerging Romanian nation state. And I argue in the book that Bessarabia's peculiarity within the Russian Empire was defined by the fact that it was contested on the one hand by an imperial polity, the Romanov state of the Romanov Empire, and on the other hand by a nation state. So this antagonism, at least again symbolically speaking, this antagonism between an empire and a nation state, well, explains to a large degree how this dynamics of symbolic construction of Bessarabia evolved during the second half of the 19th and the early 20th century, because Bessarabia was the only periphery, the only borderland of the Russian Empire that was explicitly contested by a neighboring nation state. So it was a contested borderland in the sense that two competing political centers of power were in open conflict, again, diplomatic, discursive conflict, of course, not military conflict, right? But nevertheless, were in open conflict over its belonging. And this is how I understand actually the notion of borderland as a territory that is situated between two rival centers of political power, which in this case claimed it both for their ideal state-building projects, an ideal homeland.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your complex answer. So while you explore this oscillating and transformative and complex process of symbolic construction of Bessarabia, you also explore the intellectual prehistory of the Bessarabian question. Could you try to explain what exactly was this Bessarabian question?
Yes, well, I guess I would first have to explain why I use this term prehistory, because generally the Bessarabian question is associated with what happened after World War I.
Exactly,
that is,
the interwar period.
Yes, in the interwar period, of course. And this was basically the prevailing interpretation both in the Soviet historiography and even up to an extent in its counterpart, that is the Romanian historiography and the Western historiography that emerged, of course, after World War II and mostly in the 60s and 70s. So the Bessarabian question, in its usual understanding, refers to the diplomatic conflict between the Romanian kingdom, the Greater Romania, after 1918, and the USSR over the region after it became a part of the Romanian nation state. That is, the Bessarabian question referred explicitly to a series of diplomatic negotiations, disagreements, and ultimately conflicts that developed between 1918 and 1940 and culminated, of course, with the annexation of the territory to the USSR in June 1940 as a result of the ultimatum the Soviet Union presented to Romania on the 26th of June, so 1940. So this is the Bessarabian question in its classical understanding. What I focus on in my book is, in a way, its intellectual roots and the legacies that shaped the emergence of the question itself after the Russian Revolution and World War I. And I'm interested in how the categories, the vocabulary, and the, well, if you will, the discursive framework that made this the Bessarabian question possible and imaginable after 1918 emerged in the first place. And that's why I argue that the 1860s were really crucial, because of course, the 1860s were transformative for the Russian Empire as well. It was the age of the great reforms and an age when the bureaucratic apparatus really reached, I would say, a more mature stage in the Russian Empire, so that we can finally speak about a modern bureaucracy that saw the population and the space of the empire as definable categories in an abstract sort of way. On the other hand, of course, the 1860s saw the emergence of the politically of the Romanian nation state after the union of the principalities. But why, after all, our audience may wonder, why is the Bessarabian case so interesting? And here is where I think I might have an answer, in the sense that besides being this peculiar borderland claimed both by an empire and a nation state, its other peculiarity in the Bessarabian case was that there was very little contribution, to return to the second part of your question, very little contribution from the local intellectual strata, at least before 1914, before World War I, let's say. When, and I call this a lack of articulation. So what I mean by this is that the discourses, this discursive competition over Bessarabia, the symbolic competition over Bessarabia, was actually articulated elsewhere, not so much on Bessarabian soil, but elsewhere, either at the centers of Russian political power or in Bucharest, less so in Iași, in Romania, so that it was an object of two political, let's say, models and two political discourses that emerged outside of the region rather than inside. Yes.
So you wouldn't say that the native Bessarabian intellectuals play an important role in all these disputes surrounding Bessarabia? Or can we talk about the national movement in this earlier period?
Yes, that is a very good question, and that is probably the most contentious question I had to answer in my project when confronted with the traditional historiography, and I mean here that mostly Romanian and post-91 Moldovan historiography. The short answer, again, and I should make myself clear here, I am only covering the period before the collapse of the Russian Empire. That is from the 1860s to World War I, 1914, 1917. So during this period, indeed, the contribution of Bessarabian-born intellectuals was rather marginal in the articulation of these two competing discourses, the Russian imperial and the Romanian nation-building national one. Why? Well, there are several structural, of course, factors accounting for this situation. And I will just briefly enumerate them here, list them here, rather than elaborate. So first of all, there was a very large degree of illiteracy in Bessarabia. So it was a very rural region. It was a region where, for example, taking the census of 1897, the most reliable imperial statistics, Russian imperial statistics that we have, only 15%, barely 15% of the population was urban, and 85% was rural. So there was a very late development of the public sphere in the province. I mean, where could these intellectuals have come from, actually? Well, they didn't have a lot of alternatives. Then there was a very late development of the press. So only in the early 20th century, we really see, and just before the Russian Revolution of 1905, we really see the emergence of some fledgling, newspapers, press, and periodical press that could become, the sources for this public sphere. Then we have the Russian educational policies that, and here I would make a contrast with the Habsburg case, that in contrast to the Habsburg Empire, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had a very low efficiency. They did not penetrate the rural areas until very late, and then only very partially. And that had a double effect. On the one hand, it did not actually lead to a massive Russification of the peasantry, because simply they didn't have the resources, although they had some plans, especially after the 1880s, to pursue this strategy. But second, this also led to a very late development of what one would call an intelligentsia here locally. So internally, the situation was hardly conducive to the emergence of what one could call an educated stratum. Well, but on the other hand, some Bessarabian intellectuals did have a pivotal role, a very important role in articulating these discourses of belonging of the Bessarabia. And here I mean the very small community of Bessarabians who moved to Romania, who emigrated to Romania. And of course, even if these people can be counted, I don't know, by the fingers of, well, perhaps both hands.
Both hands, okay.
If one is optimistic, yes. But still, they did articulate a quite coherent discourse of Romanian national belonging. In the case of Bessarabia, they tried to put the region on the map of the Romanian national discourse. And they did also contribute to the emergence of this vocabulary I was talking about, these rhetorical elements that were then reused in the interwar period and constantly recycled ever since. So to summarize a bit here, what we have is a bit of an asymmetry, or rather not a bit, but a quite obvious asymmetry between this contribution of Bessarabian-born intellectuals who were themselves quite marginal in the Romanian context to the Romanian part of this symbolic competition, whereas in the case of the Russian imperial counterpart to this Romanian national discourse, we have a very unimpressive, let's say, contribution of the local intellectuals, although, just not to give the impression that there was nothing at all there, and again, to return to your question about the national movement, of course, there was an inflection point when it started to, this politicization of ethnicity and all it entailed started to grow. And this was the 1905 Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution, when one really sees the beginnings of local attempts to somehow reclaim some alternative scenarios for Bessarabian, for the belonging of Bessarabia within the empire. I wouldn't go as far as talk about a full-fledged provincial consciousness. Bessarabia never achieved something even remotely similar to what happened in Bukovina or Galicia in terms of provincial, self-awareness and so on. But still, one could see that there were some elements of Bessarabian among the Bessarabian intellectuals who tried to think about possible futures for their province within the empire. But on the whole, of course, before 1917, I would say that there was hardly any articulate national movement in the region. If we, by national movement, mean a real political, politically active project of, self-identification. Because, of course, there were individuals, but these individuals hardly amounted to something that could be defined in terms of effective political action. Only in 1917, in completely different circumstances, one could talk about the emergence of such an articulate national movement.
Okay, Andrei, thank you. And going further, after the falling of the empire, how did the Great War, the First World War, and the sudden change in Bessarabia's political status from that of an imperial Russian province to supposedly becoming an integral part of the Romanian nation state? So how all these sudden changes impact on the population?
Oh, well, this is actually one of my favorite questions currently, because this is the project that I'm dealing with now, in a way. That is, I'm trying to focus on the period of World War I, and exactly my current interest is how this conflagration impacted the local population in terms of mobilization of ethnicity, mostly. And of course, in terms of how ethnic hierarchies changed. Well, just to contextualize very briefly, before I answer your question, what was the ethnic makeup of Bessarabia when the war started? So as I hinted earlier, Bessarabia was already a multi-ethnic borderland by, let's say, the mid-19th century. And besides the Romanian-speaking population, who according to the 1897 census amounted to just less than half, let's say 47.9% according to the census. But let's remember that the census took into account only the linguistic
criteria,
the spoken language, actually, rather than ethnicity. So aside from the Romanian-speaking population, significant minorities, I'm aware of the conventionality of the term, of course, where the Ruthenians or the Ukrainians, who amounted to almost 20%, the Jews, who constituted almost 12%, the Germans with over 5%, and the Bulgarians with over 3%, plus the Gagauz another 2%. The Turkish-speaking Orthodox population in southern Bessarabia, and some other less numerous ethnicities like the Poles, the Roma, and so on and so forth. So on the whole, and of course, let's not forget the Great Russians as well, who had, like, with 8%, they were quite well represented in the bureaucracy and in the cities. So on the whole, it was clearly one of the most ethnically diverse borderlands of the Russian Empire. That is why, when the war came about, well, Bessarabia was in a peculiar situation. First of all, it did not experience military occupation. And that is very important because before 1917, before the collapse of the imperial regime, Bessarabia was not subject to direct military action and repressive, the repressive aspects stemming from military occupations in general, aside from some skirmishes between the Russian and Austrian troops in the northern Hotin district, the northern extremity of Bessarabia. So it was not militarily occupied, in contrast to the neighboring Bukovina and Galicia, in contrast to Dobroja, for example, right? So no military occupation. That is important. Maybe we'll have time to see why later. Another important point, however, is that Bessarabia, well, the majority Romanian-speaking community was perceived by the Russian authorities comparatively in rather loyal and benign terms. That is, the Romanian-speaking peasantry, the Moldavians, as they were called in the Russian parlance sometimes, were perceived as a loyal, passive, well, but on the whole trustworthy community, and exactly because of their lack of political mobilization, they were not perceived as a threat. The situation was completely different in the case of other two significant ethnic communities in Bessarabia, the Germans and the Jews, or rather the Jews and the Germans, if we consider their relative weight in the population, right? I'm not talking here about the Ukrainians. That's completely another topic. because the Ukrainian, the Bessarabian, Ruthenians, Ukrainians, Rusins, variously labeled, were of course perceived as part of the Russian nation at that time by the Russian authorities, given that the so-called big Russian nation composed of three components was the officially sanctioned view of the Eastern Slavic population, let's say. Well, so the Germans and the Jews were the most heavily affected by these changing ethnic hierarchies during the war. The Germans, for obvious reasons, more or less, because they were perceived as the epitome of enemy aliens, this new category that emerged now in that period, and that labeled all the ethnic communities that were not perceived as loyal and trustworthy by the regime, and especially those of the belligerents that shared an ethnic origin with the belligerents, with the adversaries. And of course, the Germans were primarily targeted. Why this is important? Because the Bessarabian Germans, the colonists that settled southern Bessarabia in the early 19th century, were hardly politicized before the war. So they only started like sort of entering the world of mass politics. And what the war did was massively accelerating their politicization, exactly because of the exclusionary strategies and the persecutions that the Russian authorities started to target this community with. So it became, just for our audience, it would be important to understand that these were agricultural settlers. They did not have any, well, proper urban settlements in Bessarabia. We are talking about agricultural colonists here. That's why, well, they had some educational establishments, they had an established church, but they were hardly, disloyal to the Russian Empire as a whole. On the contrary, they were perceived as quite very, very trustworthy subjects of the empire before the war. And now suddenly all that changes. And there are confiscations of their landed properties. It's true, not completely. I mean, they were not massive, but they were affected. Some of them even were deported. Some of them became politically aware because of these changes, but on the whole, their status completely shifts from a loyal community to an enemy community. And when they exit the war, as it were, they are completely different as a community from the way they were before the conflagration. The Jews even more so, because the Jews, of course, did not have, in contrast to the Germans, did not have a smooth relationship with the empire at all. I mean, they were subject to heavy restrictions, as is widely known, especially after these 1882 temporary rules on the settlement of Jews in the Russian Empire. They were restricted from all kinds of political and economic activities, especially in the countryside. So the Jews were, of course, not to speak about the pogrom, the 1903 pogrom, which is why Bessarabia is mostly known outside the region even now. So the Jewish question, with all the required quotation marks. Yes, as it emerged in the early 20th century, was perhaps one of the hottest issues in Bessarabia. And again, it reflected in the region in miniature the broader processes regarding the Jewish community in the empire as a whole and beyond. So the Jews were likewise targeted as a disloyal community. They were, the Pale of Settlement was, as we know, dissolved during the war, partially because of the intent of the Russian authorities, partially because simply it was part of the war zone. So it was, and of course, what I mean here is especially that during the war, the Jews were subject to massive displacement, deportations by the Russian military authorities. Yes, the Bessarabian Jews were not so massively affected as their brethren further to the east and to the north, because again, Bessarabia was spared the military operations, but the life of the Jewish community changed forever. And it was, it was destabilized massively here as well. So I guess that these two communities, the Germans and the Jews, are probably the most the clearest example of how the war, due to its changing ethnic hierarchies, simply shifted completely not only the ethnic makeup, not so much maybe in that period in Bessarabia, but especially the ethnic hierarchies, the ethnic structures, the ethnic relations within the region. Yeah.
Okay, at this point, can we identify any continuities or discontinuities between the imperial and the national regimes regarding ethnic communities and interethnic relations? Or in other words, did Greater Romania perpetuate or attempt to break from Imperial Russia's legacy of governing what was still a multi-ethnic society?
Oh, that's a challenging question. Well, so again, one should clearly delineate here the rhetorical level and, so to say, the reality of well, although I don't like that notion too much, the actual dynamics of interethnic relations in the region. Rhetorically, of course, Greater Romania was at great pains to dissociate itself, I mean, from the Russian imperial legacy. Indeed, there are probably more, in the sense of concrete ethnic hierarchies, more ruptures than continuities between the Romanian nationalizing state, Greater Romania, and its predecessor, the Russian imperial regime, in the sense that, of course, the ethnic hierarchy shifted drastically. The Bessarabian Romanians, the Romanian-speaking population, were perceived as part of the national community, although a very problematic part, nevertheless. But still, they were part of the dominant national community of the state. And of course, they had to be sort of redeemed. They had to be culturally re-Romanianized after, in the perception of the Romanian state after this century of Russian domination. But still, they were, at least theoretically, the privileged population of the region. Now, needless to say, the Russians and the Ukrainians had a drastic, a reduction of their status as ethnic communities, although it's much more complicated than one could imagine if one follows the rhetoric or of Judeo-Bolshevism, very widespread in that period, because the Russian community itself was far from monolithic. I mean, not all the Russian speakers in Bessarabia were communist sympathizers, as we know. But of course, all these, yes, well, there were a lot of white refugees who came to Romania in this. But of course, the rhetoric and the association of Russia with Bolshevism did indeed have a very important impact on how the Russians were perceived. And the Germans, again, as I hinted, were much more ambiguous targets of nation building. They apparently had a much smoother relationship with the Romanian state than other non-Romanian ethnic communities, but still even the Germans had some grievances. So on the whole, not to go into too many details here, on the whole, of course, there was a very sizable shift both in rhetoric and in the ethnic hierarchies, and of course in the official discourse of the state. But the underlying continuities with the Russian Empire in terms of the politics of ethnicity in Bessarabia were also apparent. And one of the most important is that, Romania was, of course, Greater Romania was a nationalizing state. Now, the late Russian Empire was as well a nationalizing state. Although, of course, in completely different proportions and in a very, very different, overall context. But as in many cases of other successor states, in the post-imperial transition, Romania also borrowed, not necessarily intentionally or consciously, borrowed some strategies of management of ethnicity from its preceding regime, not only in Bessarabia, of course. I mean, we could discuss about other regions merged into Greater Romania as well. But so in these, it is this nationalizing, let's say, underlying features that allow us to speak about certain continuities. So just to summarize, I would say that there was a disjunction between the superficial level of rhetoric discourse and ethnic hierarchies and the underlying level of deep continuities in how these elements of ethnicity and ethnic and degrees of ethnic reliability actually were quantified, and in this sense one could indeed find a lot of continuities.
Okay. When thinking about Bessarabia's political and cultural development in this post-war period, are we describing a coherent sense of Bessarabian national identity among the general population, or a native elite that lacked the strategy or resources for encouraging some form of national mobilization?
Well, again, it is a very broad question. I would say that on the whole, there are more continuities than ruptures here in between the imperial and the Romanian regimes, in the sense that given the very low starting point in terms of national mobilization, ethnic mobilization, that the Bessarabian, and especially if we're talking about the Romanian-speaking population, so that the Bessarabian Romanians displayed before the war and before 1917, one could not expect either a coherent Romanian, let's say, national self-awareness from this group, or, and that is interesting, or a coherent regional identity either, because as I hinted above, there was hardly any consciousness of a specific Bessarabian identity before World War I. So in a way, when Bessarabia becomes part of Romania, there aren't as many alternatives for the very small, educated Bessarabian elite to adhere to, and of course, what's happening during the interwar period is that there emerges a stratum of educated Bessarabians, educated in Romania or even abroad, but under the auspices of the Romanian state, who are promoters of a specific, let's say, version of Romanian identity in the province. But what's interesting is that many of these people, especially the younger generation, instead of embracing wholeheartedly the Romanian national discourse, develop sort of a regionalist a regionalist tendency during the 30s, just before the annexation to the USSR. That does not mean that they are anti-Romanian, of course. On the contrary, they internalized the Romanian national project, but they see, also the shortcomings of the Romanian nation-building project in the region, and so they, being educated in Romania, they can negotiate with their cultural, the Romanian elites elsewhere on a different level. So in a way, and this is a small paradox that I would like to draw the attention of our audience to. In a way, they just because this younger generation was educated within the Romanian national project, they could articulate this Bessarabian regionalist current agenda in a way that was not possible before the war, because the Russians did not allow for this space to emerge, while the Romanians inadvertently did. So yes, probably there was no coherent sense of Bessarabian identity. I'm sure of that, more or less, although you can never be sure, of course. But I would say, yes, given what we know about so far about the degree of ethnic mobilization. But yes, but it was in the process of being somehow redefined before before the Soviet Union stepped in.
Okay, but let's look at this topic from the other side of the boat. how was Bessarabia perceived by the nationalist core in Romania, since nationalism was the main political option for interwar elites in Romania?
Yes, well, during the during the 19th century, and that's very important to understand the backstory of this. Bessarabia was rather marginal in the hierarchy of Romanian national priorities. I mean, it was not only was it less important than Transylvania, which is kind of obvious, but it was also less important than Bukovina, the neighboring region of the former Moldavian Principality, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this marginality that was very, very obvious and was hardly compensated for by these several Bessarabian intellectuals that I was talking about earlier, spilled over also in the interwar period. Only it was complicated by the fact that, again, Bessarabia was perceived as an unstable periphery because of communist agitation. Again, this myth of Judeo-Bolshevism did not help at all. Bessarabia was perceived as a hotbed of, maybe not resistance, but anyway, disloyalty, let's say, coming mostly from non-Romanian speakers, but also part of the Romanian population. So that is why it was sort of always seen as a problematic province. What did not help was that it remained quite rural. It remained, although there was some progress in terms of literacy, it remained the least literate region of Greater Romania. So there was a double discourse to summarize somehow. On the one hand, there was this discourse of authenticity, national essence, tradition that goes back, to Yorga and even much further, of course. Okay. And in this sense, the Bessarabians were seen as these authentic Romanians, unspoiled by modernity and so on. But on the other hand, and quite, at the same time, simultaneously, there was the discourse of an endangered region, of a region that was somehow still not free from the Russian sphere, whatever that meant. It meant different things to different people, and a region that was never fully included into the national core. And this ambiguity was very important to understand what happened later, even during the war, and of course also during the communist period in very different circumstances. So yes, I would say ambiguity and
Okay, so moving into recent post-Cold War history, when you look at the current borderlands that have emerged within the former Soviet space, do you still see the Republic of Moldova as being a geopolitically gray area?
Well, the short answer is probably yes.
The very short answer.
Because, yes. Why? Because the Republic of Moldova itself, first of all, it should not be conflated with Bessarabia, of course, which is done again unconsciously, again, by many people who do not realize the complexities of the geography and the ethnic makeup and the geopolitics of the region. The Republic of Moldova, in its current form, is a completely new entity. In the sense that Transnistria, for example, which is a heavy element in defining this grayness of Moldova's geopolitics, was never a part of Bessarabia. I mean, it was completely anyway, a separate regional entity before 1940. But yes, it is still a gray area because the legacies of empire matter, and they do not matter, automatically or in a crude fashion. They matter because they frame, and that was to return to my book, that was in a way what I was trying to show to this intellectual prehistory, that they matter in the way they frame arguments. They matter in the way how people think about the reality around them. And that is why the Republic of Moldova, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, maybe now a bit less so, but for reasons that do not have anything to do with change in geopolitics, rather with the processes that are underway here in this on this territory. So the Republic of Moldova was contested internally, let's say, by two state-building projects. Again, the Romanian pan-Romanian national project that argues for the eventual unification with Romania, which was in a minority, of course, within the whole population as a whole, but it was very present in the public sphere because it was dominant among intellectuals after 91. And of course, its opponent was, a very blurry continuum of nostalgic, I would, autochthonist, pro or not so pro-Russian, but anyway, anti-Romanian, let's say, definitions and views of the identity of the local population. So, although I would say that this antagonism has somehow receded in the last several years, it still structures the political imaginary of a major part of the politically active population. And it also, as in other republics, states of the so-called post-Soviet space, which I think is an increasingly irrelevant category nowadays, but still, it still determines what side of the political spectrum one sees oneself, as a part, on what side one sees oneself in this political, conundrum. And not to say, of course, that since we are now living through a quite tense period in relation to Ukraine, I would guess that these cleavages might reactivate here in Moldova as well, quicker than one could imagine several years ago.
Yeah. Finally, after all this wonderful talk, where can people go to learn more about the histories of Bessarabia?
Well, okay. There are not so many books that address the Bessarabian history, I would say, in a complex manner, not to say that there is nothing. Of course, during the last 30 years, much has been written. So just several quick references, I would say, that could help interested readers to,
yes, please,
to enter this topic. Yeah. Well, one of the most useful surveys is still Charles King's book, although it was published more than 20 years ago. So Charles King's book on the cultural politics, the politics of culture, Russia, Romania, and the politics of culture, it's called, which traces the origins of this failed nation-building project in Moldova, and Moldavia, Bessarabia, and so on. Although he focuses mostly on the 20th century, his survey is quite valid for what came before. Now, concerning the minorities, so-called minorities, non-Romanian ethnic groups, I would still recommend the works of Mariana Hausleitner on the Jews and the Germans, which are also which have been published, well, 10 to 20 years ago, but that's still quite reliable, I would say. And also, yes, on the concerning southern Bessarabia, there has been a recent work dealing with ethnicity in southern Bessarabia by Simon Schlegel, which uses more of an, I would say, anthropological lens, but still is quite interesting as an approach to this dilemma of ethnicities in southern Bessarabia, which is probably the most interesting region within this territory. And also for this transition period we were talking about, I would definitely recommend the works of my colleague Svetlana Soveiko, who addresses both the issue of ethnicity but more interestingly, how this transition from an imperial to a post-imperial order affected the elites and the well, in a way, the common people of this land as well. These are just several recommendations strictly for the period we have been talking about. I think as an initial, an initial reading material that they could be rather useful.
The list is open, right? Okay, thank you so much, Andrei, for joining us and for having this fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much for having me.